Looks like everybody has their coffee and brownie and whatever else they want. So we will get started. Good evening and welcome to the third monthly presentation of the 2022-2023 Aldo Leopold Audubon Society. My name is Jim Canales. I'm on the board of directors of the Audubon Society. And tonight it's our pleasure to welcome back Tracey to Stevens Point. He graduated in 1989 from Stevens Point. And have you been back since, Tracey?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Well, not to school.
Not to school.
Been in the
Okay. So we asked Tracey to come and talk about wetlands, water, wildlife, and watersheds, and that is what he is going to do tonight. We've got about 20 people signed up on Zoom, and about 10 people so far have Zoomed in. And so we welcome all the folks on Zoom as well as you coming here tonight. A little bit about Tracey. So he graduated in 1989 from the School of Natural Resources with a master's degree. And he moved west and he worked for 22 years as a waterfall biologist, protecting, restoring, and managing watershed scale wetland projects on the Yakima Indian Reservation in eastern Washington state. He came back to Wisconsin in 2012 to begin working with the Wisconsin Wetlands Association, and he is now the executive director. So he was kind enough to come back to Stevens Point this evening and regale us with talk about the wetlands. So Tracey, all right. One last thing, there are door prizes. And so if you sign up, because you have to sign up in the back before they leave, or?
Yes, well, we'll do that at the end of the show. So yeah, in the back, there's a clipboard.
Maybe we could pass
Put
that
your
around.
name and address. Yeah, pass it
Pass
around.
that around.
And then you could win one of these beautiful Wisconsin wetland hats, either sun hat or ball cap. So,
Okay, thanks, Tracey.
and this is the only place you can get them right now because they're not for sale anywhere on earth. How do I work this thing? No remote, is there? Do I press the
think you're
keyboard?
good. I think you can use the
Okay.
arrow keys
Great.
or the mouse.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thanks again for showing up on a starting to get chilly day, evening, and we will dive in. I got a lot of slides and a lot of things to cover, so I will move through and try and get through everything in a timely manner, and then open everything up for questions and discussion, and I'll be here as long as you guys want to be here. So, like Jim said, this is Wisconsin Wetlands Association. We're a 501c3 nonprofit. We work statewide. We're just over 50 years old now. We're the oldest statewide nonprofit dealing with wetlands policy and wetland issues in the nation. And there's since we were started, other states have copied our model, and so other places are doing this as well. Quick advertisement, since we're in Stevens Point, every February we have a big science conference. This year it will be held in Stevens Point at the Holiday Inn Convention Center. So if you're interested in that, go on our website and you can find a lot of information about that conference. Every wetland person from the whole 5-state area comes out for that every year. It's a lot of fun. So let's dive in. Well, that didn't work. Walk by the mouse. All right, well. Oh, there we go. I don't know why, but it worked. I did that one just now, so, okay.
Okay.
So I always start out these discussions with what are wetlands, just to get everybody grounded in the same place. A lot of you folks are probably very familiar with wetlands, but we'll cover the basics anyways. When you talk to scientists, they'll tell you a lot about soils and hydrology and vegetation and all these things to help you understand what a wetland is. But for my purposes, this is all you need to remember right now for tonight. Wetlands are those places in between the areas that are always dry and the areas that are always wet, right? It's the in-between zone. And because of that, you have an incredible diversity of wetland types. Some are closer to the always dry, some are closer to the always wet. And it's the hydrology, the rise and fall of the water and the seasonality, all that stuff that helps define the characteristics of your wetland. So in Wisconsin, we're blessed with an incredibly diverse array of landscapes and watershed types and geomorphology, and along with it, wetland types. When most of us think about what a wetland is, we think about a picture of something like this, right? Emergent vegetation around the edge, open water, and a bunch of wildlife, ducks, or in this case, egrets or other things out in the water. Those are very important wetlands, and they're one type of wetland we have in Wisconsin. And of course, you have an abundance of bird species. Since we're at the Audubon, I thought I'd better talk about the kind of birds using some of these wetland species. I won't go through them all, but you can take a look at those lists. We also have sedge meadows and low prairies. These were some of the most abundant of wetlands, especially in the southern part of the state historically, and obviously some of the wetlands that were most easily converted to agriculture. So we've lost vast amounts of these beautiful, incredibly diverse habitats over the years. And the northern harrier is associated with many of these types as well. And I want to tell a quick story about harriers. I'm an old duck biologist, and one of the things that us duck biologists do in the course of our work oftentimes is going out looking for duck nests. And ducks nest on the ground in usually grass fields or sedge meadows and places like that. And oftentimes when you're looking for duck nests, you'll come across a harrier nest. Now, a duck nest is hidden under the vegetation. They don't want to be predated, right? And birds coming in and getting them, or skunks or whatever. Harriers, on the other hand, when you find a harrier nest, it's a big, wide open, the vegetation is all smushed down like here, and it's a wide open 3 or 4 open area in the grass with 3 or 4 little babies just open to the world like that. Now, the interesting thing is when you find a harrier nest, when you're out looking for duck nests, and this is not in the literature so much, but it's something that all us duck biologists are familiar with, you start to find duck nests around that harrier nest. Well, how can that be? Why would that make sense? Isn't that a predator? Well, you go back later to check on those duck nests to see if they hatched, and you find out why. Those harriers just about take your head off. They protect that whole area, and the ducks have figured out, I'm going to go over by that thing to lay my nests, lay my eggs. And in those areas near the harrier nest, or if you have an abundance of harriers in your fields, those nest success goes way up. So who would have thunk, right? There's a lot of stuff going on in nature. We know about this much about it. And there's interactions and things going on. When we start messing around out there, we're doing damage to things we have no idea what we're damaging. And this is a good indication of how things are connected that aren't always obvious. So harriers are very important for ground nesting birds. So when you see harriers, rejoice, because that means you've got good conditions for other, not just ducks, but other ground nesting birds as well. Of course, floodplain forests, another really important wetland type in here. This is, I think, down in the lower Sugar River, associated with creeks and rivers. And, you know, in the spring when the waters rise, we'll talk more about floodplains in a little bit, but incredibly dynamic and diverse habitats as well. And many, many different species in these areas. Prothonotary warbler is one of the most, showy of them. So if you haven't been out in places like the lower Wisconsin River, broad floodplain, get out there sometime and visit that. Forested wetlands are the wetlands that we also call swamps. Well, you know, a lot of us call wetlands swamps, right? When we mean wetland, we say swamp, and even I do sometimes, but a swamp is actually a wetland with woody vegetation in it. So technically speaking, and of course, all kinds of different species associated with swamps and wooded wetlands. Shrub thickets. I like to show this picture because if you've never walked through an alder thicket, guess what? It's thick. And this is what it looks like when you're in the middle of an alder thicket. I would encourage you, if you've never done it, to get out and do it, especially one where you have nice tussock sedge meadows. They're really hard to walk through. You take one step, you might go up to your waist, but beautiful, beautiful, really important habitats, and especially in the northern part of the state. Of course, in the southern, we have more willow, shrub willow, and cars, and dogwoods and things like that. And the yellowthroat, as you all know, the yellowthroat and the song you hear whenever you're near an area like that. You can't help but hear the common yellowthroat calling. Fens are really unique, beautiful, diverse, and rare wetlands anymore in Wisconsin. These are the wetlands that are literally groundwater fed. Oftentimes, especially in the southern part of the state, you'll have groundwater coming up and it spreads out and it gets captured as a wetland. And over the, the years and the decades and the centuries, that vegetation builds up over time, making a peat. And the spring oftentimes then stays through the middle of that vegetation, and you'll get a mound developing. You can go out around Whitewater and you'll find some of these really classic fen mounds. And you walk up to the top of the fen and it gets wetter as you go up the hill until you get to the top where the spring is coming out. And the vegetation is almost circular as you go up the hill. You'll see one type and then you'll get up, and then there's bulrush halfway up the hill and different things. And it's really, really neat. Where do you go? And actually you're going up the hill into the wetland. And but that's what a fen mound is. Unfortunately, once again, incredibly impacted by agricultural development over the last 100+ years. Bogs, oftentimes they get put in with fens, but they're very different things. Bogs are mostly surface water fed, and of course acidic, and you know all about the carnivorous plants and things associated with these very, very difficult environments for plants to live in. So they've adapted a lot of different tricks to do that. Incredibly beautiful, diverse, and a lot of really good bog habitat in the northern part of the state. And of course, a whole host of bird species using those areas. Ephemeral and seasonal ponds. I always like to talk about these because these are some of the wetlands that are most overlooked by most people, but they're actually some of the most important wetlands on the landscape. They're really, really workhorse wetlands. These 4 photos are the same scene taken from the same angle 4 different seasons of the year. And ephemeral wetlands are those that fill up with spring rains and snow melt and will pond up water oftentimes in forested environments. And over the course of time, then the water either soaks into the ground or transpires up or out. And by the end of the summer, you can have a dry basin. And that's why they're so overlooked and people don't think of them as wetlands. Oftentimes they say, well, I don't have any wetlands out there, just a bunch of ponds or puddles. Oftentimes people will say. Incredibly important though, especially for capturing rain and snow melt and holding it on so it's not rushing down your landscape, causing erosion and gullying and everything else down the way. In a landscape where you have abundant ephemeral wetlands, it's amazing the amount of snow and rain that landscape can handle with very minimal damage or problems elsewhere. And the wildlife using ephemeral wetlands are especially these guys here. Amphibians have really keyed in to this. And the reason frogs and toads and salamanders like these places is because they dry up. So as soon as the ice is off, they're in there cranking out their eggs, getting their business done, because they know that thing's going to dry up soon. And so they want to put their eggs in there and get the young off before it all goes to heck. And the reason they like those places, because it dries up, there are no fish in there. So the amount of predators eating the eggs and the baby toads and frogs are much less in that type of environment. So incredibly important. And then having healthy wooded habitats next to these ephemerals is also very, very important. So when they get out of the water, they can survive as well. So let's get to the point, what good are wetlands? These guys know why wetlands are good. They know why wetlands are important, but why should we care about wetlands? Let's start with a little video. We made that video a few years ago, and the first version of it, the first draft was horrible. We thought, oh, this is going to be a total failure. We just really were discouraged. And we had about 5 videos we were making. You know, this was the only animated one of the batch, and we thought it was a throwaway. And it turned out in the second round, it turned out better than any of the other videos made. So we use it a lot. It was even on the tour with the Wild and Scenic Film program a few years ago when it first came out. So, oops, sorry. So to review, yeah, wetlands are incredibly important on the landscape to capture water, of course, and we've lost so many of our wetlands that normally capture water. We'll talk about the implications of that here in a second. This is actually a pothole wetland in the western part of the state. Who knew we had true prairie pothole wetlands in Wisconsin, but we do have in a very small part of the state. This is near Somerset. And wetlands along our creeks and rivers, floodplain wetlands are very, very important. So as the water comes down, it spreads out. This is a nice, just total sedge meadow with the channel winding through it. And most of the water is flowing, not even in the channel, right through this whole area here. Beautiful, beautiful, really not only diverse, but really important for capturing flood flows, slowing the water down, allowing it to spread out and reduce the energy that is too often associated with floodwaters. And when we remove our floodplains, when we remove our upper watershed wetlands, of course, this is the result. And the water's got to go somewhere. And what we're finding these days, especially with climate change now, the way it's being expressed in Wisconsin is oftentimes we'll have these big storms come in about 8 o'clock at night in the summer, and they'll park in one location and they can drop a foot or more of rain in one spot. And, you know, the results are just disastrous. And what we're finding is landscapes, even in Wisconsin, the landscapes that have abundant wetlands that are still in pretty good shape are able to handle those types of events much, much more successfully than the ones where we've lost our wetlands and we've done our development and our disturbance. Nobody wants this. But when you build in a floodplain or you remove the wetlands upstream of this, this is ultimately the result, and there's no getting around it these days. Wetlands also, like I said, reduce runoff energy. So when it flushes off the land, there's a lot of energy involved in that, and you can literally eat away. As you know, you can create gullies and other things in one storm event, you know, cause this, these poor dogs are almost falling off the cliff there. But very important, wetlands on the landscape prevent type of water movement and capture those flows and keep the land intact. And all that soil's got to go downstream, right? And deposit somewhere else. Wetlands are great at cleaning agricultural runoff. These two photos were taken on one side of the road and the other at the same time. On the left, of course, is runoff coming off a cropped field, and on the right is actually a cropped field that had gone back into wetlands. They'd restored it back into wetlands, and the difference is so obvious. And I will say wetlands are also really good at helping process certain nutrients as well, especially nitrates. Wetlands protect our shorelines. Too often we've removed these and we have shore erosion going on in so many of our lakes in Wisconsin. Wetlands store carbon. In Wisconsin, we're one of the few states in the nation that probably has more histosol type wetland soils than anywhere else. And those are some of the best soils, you know, over the centuries for capturing carbon. And what's going on in a lot of the state, we've developed these into agriculture. They call them muck farms, right? You've heard of muck farms? And they're these big, deep, you know, carbon-rich soils, muck histosols. It took big drains to get these things farmable, and we put them into production. And all that thousands of years of carbon, then when it's exposed to the air, where does it go? It goes up into the air. So we literally are losing our carbon out of the soil by drying up these soils. There are muck farms you can go to now that have literally subsided 6 feet since they were originally developed. And that's because of the carbon loss out of the soil over the years. Wetlands are good for trout habitat. This is up in the Pinocchio Hills. This beautiful sedge meadow is along a place called Bulgus Creek, a class 1 trout stream. This is it right here. That's Bulgus Creek. So I was out in this wetland. This was in July several years ago. And I thought, oh, good, I'll stand in the creek and take a picture of this beautiful sedge meadow floodplain. I took one step and whoosh, went right over my head. And I got really excited. I'm an old duck hunter, so the camera didn't get wet. You know, that's the last thing that gets wet is your gun, right? And I was so excited because here is a wetland doing its job, creating narrow and deep channel conditions that the trout love. And there's no better place than this if you're a trout. And if you would remove these wetlands, you would have had a big washed out, you know, wide, nasty gully with very little trout habitat in it. So it was the wetlands in this watershed that were allowing these conditions to persist in the class 1 trout stream conditions. So beautiful, beautiful area. Of course, lakefish habitat, we all know that muskies and northerns and even walleyes in some areas will go into wetlands to spawn. This is Kyle Magyar. He's one of our policy folks. He's actually from Plover, Wisconsin. He's a local boy with one of his fish a few years ago. And of course, wildlife habitat. I don't know if this is true, but we always hear the phrase 75% of our state's wildlife uses wetlands for some portion of their life cycle. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but I choose to use that figure. Here are 2 different species of cranes, right? And I finally found out how to tell a sandhill crane from a whooping crane. It took me a long time, but the whooping cranes have those crazy colors on their legs. Yeah. And that's the best way to tell them. So it's hard to see a whooping crane these days without those colors on their leg, by the way. Of course, great for recreation, as you all know, no matter what you like to do, wetlands are a great place to do it. Maybe not bicycle riding, but just about everything else. And education, of course, the incredible diversity and just about every educational subject you can think of, it's appropriate to do teaching in a wetland for whatever subject you're interested in. So get your kids out there, get the classes out in the wetlands and use those. And of course, cultural uses. I worked for, decades for a tribal government out west. And out there, they would use hardstem bulrush to make tule mats. They call hardstem bulrush, they call tules out west. And they make these large mats, and that's what covers their traditional structures, are these tule mats. They're really good at repelling moisture. This one on the upper left is actually on the Menominee reservation. That's soft stem bulrush, a much smaller bulrush plant, and they make mats out of that. It's not for structural purposes, but for other purposes on the Menominee. So really neat use of wetland plants. We were restoring wetlands out in Yakima, literally with the intent of growing the best quality tules that we could. And the women would go out every year and harvest them. And it was really exciting to see those wetlands being put to use amongst other cultural uses. And of course, wild rice. We all know about wild rice. Wild rice only occurs naturally in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and in Michigan, the upper Midwest, and an incredibly nutritious and versatile food source that oftentimes is all too much in threat these days, especially with the changing hydrologic conditions that our waterways are suffering these days. So historically, we were really wet state in Wisconsin, weren't we? We had 10 million acres of wetlands historically. That is, on average, a wet foot about every 3 or 4 steps, kids. That's a lot of water. But over the years, we've really changed things, haven't we? We've changed the way water moves, through urban development, transportation, upper watershed conversion. That's the easy stuff to drain, is the stuff in the upper portions of the watershed. Drainage, channelization, climate change. Over top of all these changes that we've made, human changes, we're putting these climate issues over top of it all. And of course, wetland and floodplain loss. Now this photo on the bottom left here, that is a famous photo. That's the dredge they used to drain Horicon Marsh way back when. And they lived on that thing. And of course, government programs, we were really busy boys back then, draining every inch of land that we could. And many of the wetlands that we tried to drain never did drain. So they never were farmable, but the legacy of a ditch through those wetlands persists to this day. And it maybe is still a wetland, but it's a degraded wetland. And oftentimes those reed canary grass covered wetlands because of the disturbance. So like I say, we had 10 million acres originally. We've lost half our wetlands in Wisconsin. That's a lot of wetlands to lose. And much of the wetlands that are left, especially in the southern, from like Highway 10 or 29 south, most of the wetlands in the southern part of the state are in pretty bad shape. You go to the northern part of the state, we have some really nice wetlands and relatively untouched, but we've had, you can't take half of your wetlands away without serious implications to your other resources. And it's not spread out evenly. Like I say, a lot of it happened in the southern part of the state. Northern part of the state is still in pretty decent shape, even though there's a lot of subtle changes that we don't notice, and especially along our creeks and our channels and those types of places where we actually put in our temporary dams and use them to haul logs and everything. There's hardly a creek in the northern part of the state that hasn't been impacted in one way or another by the logging industry over time, and still healing from those disturbances. So wetland loss, of course, brings challenges. Just like I said, when we change the way water flows and when wetlands are managing your water, these are the types of things that happen. This is in Ashland County a few years ago after about a 15-inch rain over about a day and a half period. We've developed our floodplains. We don't have the ability of our water to spread out. Oftentimes we've pushed the channel over to the edge of the floodplain and we develop everything out. So that channel then becomes like a fire hose, and we move water into places where we normally didn't have water before or don't want water now. Anybody recognize this? This is the Phelps Dairy Farm down in Plover. It's a little wet. This is one of those March days when the ground was frozen and rain on snow. So what's happened then also in our upper watershed areas because of wetland use and loss of prairies and the the loss of the ability of the upper areas to hold water and slow it down, that's caused erosion, that's caused all that sediment to come down into our floodplains. This is the driftless area where it's very famously, a lot of our floodplains have been buried by several feet of sediment. And literally over the course of about a 20-year period around the turn of the 1900s, all that dirt that was uphill came down there. You go out in these banks and you oftentimes can see the black line where the original floodplain was. That's all wetland soils. A lot of these creeks in the driftless were anastomosed, multi-channeled things with sedge meadows wall to wall, and now they're buried under several feet. And when you do that, it's harder for the water to rise up and spread out on the floodplain because it's a new floodplain that's higher. And so what you get then is higher energy going down these channels. It can't get out of bank, the water can't slow down, and we're blowing out bridges, we're causing damage downstream because we're confining our flood flows into these narrow channels. And then the channel itself then makes it worse. You know, you get these feedback loops where it's starting to dig itself deeper and deeper and deeper, and one thing after another. You're out of balance, that's for sure. Channelization is another example. This is kind of a hard picture to see, but there's a wetland going through this. This is actually just northeast of Stevens Point. And so many of these wetland situations, way back when we dug a channel through here. The cropland on the south here is high and dry. None of this is affecting the ability of that land to farm, but that channel then is reducing the ability of that wetland to maintain the hydrology it needs for the diverse vegetation that should be growing there. All over the state, you run into these things. These are some of the no-brainer, low-hanging fruit restoration actions we could implement in Wisconsin, is just erasing these types of situations. And no cropland would be harmed by doing this. And when you channelize it and runs it all down, this is what happens. You get gully development. This is in the driftless area as well. Just upstream from this washout is a big parking lot area. There were wetlands behind this person, but they're overwhelmed now. And this is still an active cut going on. This is at the top of the hill in the driftless area. It gets worse as you go downhill. So the power of water is incredible for causing damage and landscape alteration. Of course, worst case scenario, the whole thing unravels, right? This is a famous photo from Coon Valley, Wisconsin. This is the photo that launched the Federal Soil Conservation Service way back when. How do you fix that? You can't. And think about the amount of sediment that was lost here that had to go somewhere else, right? We're changing our landscape in ways that we can't put back. So then we have to think about what's plan B. How do we restore places like this? Of course, we're tiling and we're ditching our agricultural landscapes. We're taking all that water that's in the soil, dumping it into ditches, sending it down into our creeks, all the way down to New Orleans. And this Central Sands area is a great example of that, right? You look at all these big trout streams that are turned into ag ditches. And even the farmers, you know, get a tear in their eye every spring, watching all that water that should be soaking into the ground going down to New Orleans. We're fundamentally altering our groundwater, our surface water, everything with these features. And of course, that makes some areas drier. This is not the Little Plover River, believe it or not, which is, you know, everybody talks about. This is actually an Adams County mud lake. So some places, because of this alteration, can dry up. Other places are wetter. When we remove the wetlands and the features that can hold water in the upper portions of our watershed, that water, guess what, goes downhill, right? Because that water flows downhill. We can oftentimes have wetter situations in our lower watershed areas than we had naturally. And of course, all this stuff is bringing in invasive plants because it's creating altered conditions, disturbed landscapes. You can disturb your landscape by running a dozer over it, by altering the hydrology, by doing a number of different things. And the result is oftentimes things like this. This, of course, is Phragmites. And this photo, I love to show it because isn't this photo the definition of optimism? Look at this poor guy. But he's at it, you know, what is that, the little engine that could or whatever. Yeah, I think I can. course, our rivers are running dirty thanks to wetland loss. These are two adjacent waterways up in Bayfield County that flow into Lake Superior. Of course, the one on the left has abundant wetlands in the upper watershed. The one on the right does not. These photos were taken 45 minutes apart in an April day. And of course, all this translates oftentimes to human suffering. This is the result in 2016 of 15 inches of rain in Ashland County, Iron County, that whole area, in about a day and a half. $35 million just in public infrastructure damage. 2 lives were lost. And this is an example of a roadway washed out. That, by the way, is the guy that had the big muskie. That's the same guy there. That's Kyle. And I will say we did touch up this photo. This is an altered photograph. Kyle's shirt originally matched the back soil behind him almost perfectly. So we made his shirt blue. But that's the only alteration we made in this photo. But when you're Ashland, the town of Ashland, and your road budget on a normal year is 75% of your town's budget, this is important stuff to you. So we're doing a lot of work up in these landscapes, especially in this area, helping people understand, and we'll talk about it in a minute, what can we do to get wetlands back to solve this issue here? Why would the roads crew in the town of Ashland care about wetlands? This is why, because wetlands can help prevent this. So how do we turn all this around? Wetlands as solutions. A big part of our organization is really working towards wetlands as solutions. And in Wisconsin, we have some of the strongest wetland protection regulations in the nation, even though a lot of times we feel like we don't, right? We don't think they're adequate enough. We do. I mean, compared to other folks, but we need more than just wetland protection regulations. We need to protect the half that we have left, but we've got a lot of work to do to start putting wetlands back on the ground if we're ever going to solve all the issues that we just looked at. And that means protection, restoration, and long-term management. So that means we have to be smart, and we have to be thinking at a watershed scale and think about not only do we need wetlands back, but how much wetlands do we need, what types of wetlands, and in what locations do we need them to solve the challenges that our communities are facing. And it's a different answer in every community, right? Too often conservation programs come in with, hey, I've got money for wetlands, who wants to sign up? And that's great, it goes to good use, but it's not necessarily getting the right amounts of the right wetlands in the right locations to solve whatever specific issues are happening there. So a big part of our work now is trying to move conservation in this direction. Obviously continue funding the people that want to fund it for ducks and frogs and pretty flowers, but how do we get wetlands back on the landscape in the areas that we need it? And we don't just need hundreds or thousands of acres put back in Wisconsin. We literally need hundreds of thousands of acres of wetlands back on the landscape if we're seriously going to solve these issues. We always say wetlands aren't the only thing we need to fix our water problems, but we can't fix them without wetlands. So that's our job, is the wetland piece of this. And it's a big job. Hundreds of thousands of acres have to go back to help solve these water issues. So how do we do that? How do we get that amount of wetlands back on the landscape? A lot of the work we're doing now is helping people understand why they should care about wetlands. So oftentimes wetland conservation is aimed at people that like frogs and ducks and pretty flowers, but we're finding out that's not getting enough wetlands back on the landscape to solve these issues. So we've got to get other people understanding and motivated to want to put wetlands back. So in other words, we have to help people understand why wetlands are important for the things they already care about. So if you're the road crew in the town of Ashland, if you can understand why wetlands help your road budget, that's an important thing. And I use that example because that's happening right now. They're really excited about wetland restoration in the right places above the culverts that keep washing out in their town year after year. So that's a lot of the things that we're working on. How do we get other people that never think about wetlands understand why they should care about them because of the benefits they have? And we have to work with private landowners, right? look at this statistic, 75% of Wisconsin's current wetlands are in private ownership. That surprises a lot of people because you think of Hork and Marsh, you think of all these big protected areas, that's only 25% of all the wetlands. 85% of the wetlands that were lost are on private land. So if we're going to start putting wetlands back, guess what, kids? We got to put them back on private land. So a big part of the equation is this. We've got to get to the point where wetlands are really a part of the norm of landowners and how communities think about the health of their landscapes and the things that need to be done to create the conditions adequate for healthy and safe living. So there's a lot of new planning tools out there right now. We're involved in the Marengo River this is not the Marengo River watershed, but this is a good map showing an example. We now have some really good assessment tools where we can utilize technology and on the ground verification to help identify the places where wetlands used to be, that in this situation, these red areas are places where wetlands could be brought back to help capture runoff, where the wetlands used to be there to capture runoff and they're gone now. And that helps you then with the idea of how much and where do we need to put them, right? This type of assessment is really important now. And it's very exciting times because you can lay that down with landowners and with roads departments and cities and towns, and they can understand the landscape, and it helps get them motivated to use wetlands as part of the solutions to the issues they're having. And the nice thing about wetlands, oftentimes it's a lot cheaper to start restoring wetlands in the right places than it is to put in a new water treatment plant or some of these other very expensive things to solve our problems, especially problems that will keep persisting year after year, even with the expense. We got to expand our toolbox. Literally, when you think about wetlands in Wisconsin, when people talk about wetland restoration, they almost always talk about a thing that we call a scrape. Oh, well, we'll talk to people, well, we need wetlands back here. Well, I don't see what a scrape is going to do to help my situation. And the problem is so much of our wetland talk and restoration has been, and I won't go into it today, but it goes back years and years to where we thought we could go in and do some things that were unnatural to provide specific benefits for specific species. And the wetland scrape was one of those things where we go down and try and dig out, make a duck pond, right, to see if we can't get some ducks growing. Oftentimes those are failed attempts because they get choked in with cattail and they create unnatural conditions. So we really need to look at other places where they're doing wetland restoration, trying to bring these features back on the landscapes in the manner that they existed historically, to start healing and addressing the water movement issues that we're having in our watersheds right now. And so there's a lot of work going on in that regard. And we need practices that don't necessarily require, conversion of cropland or things like that, because we'll never get to scale that we need to if it means the land's got to go out of production or this or that and into some protected status. It'll never happen. Those things need to continue to happen in the right places, especially for biodiversity. But when we're talking working landscapes on the landscape, working wetlands to solve our water issues, we're talking working farms, working places. So it has to make sense to the community, to the landowners, et cetera, et cetera. Little Plover River is a really good example of a collaboration. We've been involved in this for several years, and the village of Plover, the DNR, the potato growers, Portage County, DNR, a bunch of people are involved now in helping look at the Little Plover River watershed as a whole, and what can we do to bring back conditions that will help bring back the health of the Little Plover River, not just the flow, but also habitat conditions, the conditions for trout, and the economic conditions and the flood reduction conditions that the community needs. Really exciting stuff. That's another talk for another day. But if anybody is interested in what's going on in Little Plover River, I'd love to take you all out on a tour next spring or summer and show you some of the work. And the answer on Little Plover River, a big part of the answer is wetlands. There was a significant amount of wetland loss in this watershed. And we're starting to bring it back now in floodplain reconnection. A lot of stuff going on in a way that's getting all the partners involved in businesses, agricultural landowners, government, nonprofits, and it's a really exciting collaborative effort right now. So like I said, it's all about viewing wetlands as solutions to the issues that we face. And that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. It's exciting from our standpoint because we're seeing light bulbs go off in people's head when you do that. And we think this is going to be one of the really most important ways of getting wetlands back on the landscape and healthy again. So remember, save all the parks, right? Talked about the Harrier, stuff that isn't obvious is really important out there. Care for it and they will come. There's a lot of really nice protected areas and we always have surprises, right, in these places and good surprises because we've protected things in their natural state. Diversity is really, really important. I counted one time all the different plants in this photo. It's a lot. I don't remember what the number is, but that's our protection, right? That's our sustainability is when you spread out the diversity and the different things. And I always show this, don't dig here. One of the biggest things that we get from landowners, they'll call us up and say, oh, can you come out and look at my place? I want to improve my wetland. I want to make a duck pond. And you'll go out there and you'll see this beautiful tussock sedge meadow. Don't you dig there? This thing is really good. It's actually even good for waterfowl. When we have the good stuff, let's protect it. Let's care for it. Let's keep it there. Let's not mess around with it. And volunteer, as you all are. You're all active in this chapter here. So thank you for the work that you do helping the resources of this region. And support groups for working for wetlands. Look at this, Stone Lake Community Wetland Park. Who knew there was a wetland park in Wisconsin, right? This is up near Spooner. And they created a wetland park to handle the runoff to some new development that they were doing in Stone Lake. And by development, that's a small D in a place like that. And they celebrate their wetlands now. And they have a wetland park. And join groups like us. You know, we work hard to bring wetlands back. If you're interested in wetlands, we would love to have you as a member. There's information in the back table. We have a thing going on now. If you haven't heard that, we have a sweepstakes going on where you can win a new members get into a drawing. They can win a restored 1941 Old Town wood canvas canoe. It's just gorgeous, and a few other prizes as well. So. If you're interested in wetlands, there's all kinds of information back there, and I'm happy to talk with you about that. Most importantly, though, get out there and get your feet wet. And when you do, bring a friend. That's my friend there. So thanks so much. I'm happy to answer any questions or have a discussion. And we've got to do the drawing here. So I don't know if you have them all up or bring them up.
Well, I have a question.
Okay.
So since most of the wetlands are privately owned, why do people develop them? Are they developing the wetlands for housing? Do they create more farmland? And
so a huge chunk of our wetland loss occurred over the last 150 years, right? Our wetland loss occurring now is actually just a fraction of what it was historically. So most of the loss we've had already happened. We do have strong protections. Some of it had been weakened in the last few years, but relatively speaking, we're not losing many wetlands anymore, right? So most of the conversion of wetlands to other conditions, especially happened during agricultural development. The big, bulk of it. Also, of course, city development was very important locally. Milwaukee was built on a big wetland, things like that. So road development can change the way water flows, right? You can alter the direction of flow. I mean, there's some places where we're literally moving water through drainage ditches and pipes from one watershed to another, things like that. So it isn't just wetland loss, but it's all the way we've altered the way water flows through the landscape. And wetlands are some of the most important features in managing that movement of water through the landscape, whether it be surface, groundwater, whatever. So
thank you.
we always got to be thinking about wetlands when we're thinking about the problems that we have. So let's pull a name out of the hat, literally, huh?
Are there other questions?
Well, yeah, we can continue the questions, or we can do the hat too. So if anybody has questions, raise your hand. You get to choose one or the other. Okay, ready?
All right.
There it is. Cindy. Yes. I was at Cindy's property on the way up today. She runs a buffalo ranch now where they have a beautiful, gorgeous wetland right in the middle of it. It's just wonderful.
Your choice.
Great work protecting their wetlands. They can either some half or all can. And I don't know if there are two different sizes of the sun, small, medium. This
I
one's
said
large.
to you when I walked in, my husband would want.
All right,
this
there you
hat.
go.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah. Thank you.
So thank you for coming out. Great. Any other questions? Yes.
The Little Plover River, if I remember right, almost dried up a few years ago because I think it was a drought type summer and the irrigation kind of zapped it.
Yeah.
Just, I know you don't want to get into a long conversation about it. We probably could talk about it for a long time, but how would you rate the Little Plover River right now? Would you say excellent, poor, fair, back to its normal?
Work in progress. How about that?
Okay.
It's gonna take several years. The collaboration is just getting started. They've been doing some. Little Plover River, we always say, is baby's first watershed. The river itself is, well, it's really a creek. It's called a river because it's named after the Plover River, right? But I mean, it's only a few CFS flowing. So calling it a river is a bit of a stretch. But it did dry up during some drought years, and they've been studying the Little Plover River now for decades. And it was one of the places where we first learned very clearly with some early studies in the 60s of the impact of groundwater removal on features like creeks and rivers running through a sandy substrate like this. And so we've known about this forever. Of course, irrigation developed more and more and more. And we're drying up and dropping our groundwater and taxing our watersheds, not just Little Plover River, but throughout the Central Sands area, to the point where we're starting to see some implications. So then the question is, how do you fix this, right? And for many, many years, there was a lot of controversy and fighting and trying to get regulations set up, and it was going nowhere. And so a few years ago, some of the folks in the area said, well, can we at least start working together to try and get some stuff on the ground to address this stuff outside of the regulatory process, right? A voluntary approach. So that's what the collaboration ended up coming together that way. So great, let's start looking at this and start looking at it from a watershed standpoint. So we got involved. They asked us to be in on it, and we said, okay, yeah, this is something that we'd be interested in. We started looking at the history of the watershed, how it was formed, how it functioned before any development, and telling that story and what changes have gone on. And the story is much bigger than just irrigation removal. It's a lot more complicated than that. So we started looking at all these different things, and the wetland loss was a big part of the impacts of Little Plover River. Little Plover River is 80% groundwater fed. Right, so groundwater comes out of the ground. That's why you have trout here. It'd be too warm in this area to have trout if it wasn't groundwater fed. And the water comes out of the base of the moraine, which is just east of the village of Plover, and beautiful water bubbling out. And of course, that's been lowered because of irrigation withdrawal. And it's also been reduced because of wetland loss. That whole area at the base of the moraine was a huge wetland historically. It had all been ditched off, 100 years ago. So we started looking at that. We started looking at some groundwater models and coming up with some plans on how can we identify the most important priority actions that need to be done now to start working towards improvement, right? And that meant identifying the places of groundwater removal that were having the most impact on the river. And in some cases, removing them altogether. And in other places, working with conservation, trying to reduce the amount of usage in certain areas. But we had the luxury of a really nice groundwater model that we could utilize to help set our priorities. So not all the wells are equal in terms of their impact on the river. So where are the ones that we can work on most importantly to bring that flow back? And then how can we bring those wetlands back to capture that water the snow melt and the runoff and et cetera to recharge that groundwater in there. And there were some big ditches in the upper part of that watershed draining the whole area that was causing a total loss of water that should have persisted over the summer. And of course, the important thing with places like Little Plover River isn't necessarily how's the water flowing year round. It's how's the water flowing in the toughest time of the year, which is July and August, September, right? So we're really working on how do we get water persisting in there. And we found out a lot of things. Besides wetland loss, there was floodplain disconnection. There was all the trees growing along Little Plover River didn't exist there historically. That was all a big sedge meadow, you know, when it was back. And one thing led to another. All these things went on, and it's a really interesting story. And it got people involved that you wouldn't normally think of being involved in things like this. So we consider it just beginning. We feel there's a lot of work to do, but I think it's in a lot more healthy condition now than it was. And I think we're more resilient to the drought times than we were before. And so if you're interested in that, it's a great tour. It's a pretty easy tour. I'd love to take the group out here sometime in the spring and show you some of these areas where we've been filling ditches and bringing wetlands back and some really cool stuff happening here. There also may be a mini symposium or a session on it at our wetlands conference in February. So if you come to that, it's a little advertisement for that. Maybe you can learn about that as well. So yeah, good stuff. And it shows how when people all come together and you can spread out the pain to a lot of different folks, it's really exciting, the things that can get done because it makes sense to everybody. Yes, sir.
How long has this been going on, your story?
So Little Plover River work has been going on since about 2018. So it's really just been a few years. Yeah.
Because the only other thing I've ever heard on TV is, Plover River drying up.
Yeah, right.
Nothing.
There were some drought years where,
No positive stories.
yeah, and so they were pumping, and there was some drought years going on. And the whole watershed was so out of whack that it dried up, not the whole river, dried up in a couple of locations over the course of certain years during drought times. And so we dropped low this late summer and the conditions maintained itself pretty good through even the dry time of year this year because the floodplain's reconnected again. The channel is in a different form than it was before. It's narrow and deep now where it used to be 40 foot wide, where historically it was only 5.5 foot wide. Historically, we know that from the old GL Rouse surveys. They measured the width of Little Plover River in 1853, and it was 5.5 feet. When we started this project, it was 40 feet wide and about shin deep at the deepest point. And how are you going to, even with water in there, how are you going to keep trout alive? Something like that. Anyways, a lot of these different things work together, and we're starting to see, I think, some sustainability now. There'll still be droughts. Will it ever dry up again? Maybe. Did it dry up historically? All the hydrologists say, yeah, even historically, it would occasionally dry up after several years of drought. But, so far, so good. Yeah.
What effect are cranberry marshes having on?
So that's a really interesting thing. And so there's a lot of we're just starting to, there's some work beginning now in the 14-mile watershed, if you know where that is, kind of from Plainfield west towards the river. Incredibly ditched watershed and cranberry marshes in there. And there's some real nutrient issues going on in the 14-mile watershed. And we're starting to look at the cranberry marshes as potential solutions, believe it or not, to that. Because the cranberries, they need to have clear water irrigating their crops, right? They don't want heavy nitrates and things like that in the water that they're irrigating with. So they actually been using, many cranberry marshes use wetlands to filter their water before they even use it for irrigation. So are there ways of utilizing industry in creative ways to help solve watershed scale issues? And just beginning the talks with the cranberry grower. Are you a cranberry grower?
Used to be.
Yeah, okay. So there's a lot of excitement right now in how can we utilize good farming practices and different things to solve these issues. Because in a place like the 14 Mile that is so heavily developed with agriculture, guess what? The answer isn't remove half the agriculture, right? That's not the starting point. As much as somebody might want it, it's never going to happen. So what can we do to maintain healthy agricultural production in ways that also recharge the groundwater, clean the water, provide the benefits? And it can be done. And there's a lot of new techniques and assessment methods happening right now. So anyways, keep an eye on the 14 Mile. Hopefully there'll be good things happening there in the future. It's just beginning right now. And so I'm really excited about the future. I love working in agricultural communities. I think, the landowners have a love of land. Most of the landowners are multi-generational people, right? On the same land. You better believe they care about the land and water, right? And we need to have solutions that help maintain the agricultural economy as well. These creative things, looking at things from a watershed perspective.
Let me ask you some more. The map, your project, is it going further than the map you were showing? Or
Yeah,
is
that didn't show the whole watershed. That was just kind of showing the actual creek, the creek itself is 5 miles from the base of the moraine to the Wisconsin River is only 5 miles. And half of that's urban and half of it's agricultural. And so, we have the luxury of a really nice groundwater model now in the Little Clover River watershed that shows the movement of groundwater and where it's coming from, most importantly, feeding into the river. So we can use that to prioritize how we're working with the farmers in those areas. And we have the techniques now, by we, I mean the hydrologists, right? Where they can identify high cap wells and put them in clusters and say, okay, if we can save 10% of the water coming out of these wells, and that will do this. If we can save 15% over here. And anyways, you're pinpointing your conservation so you can work with, 2 or 3 farmers and say, it would be great if we could find a way to save this amount of water. How do you want to do it? And so no one's dictating something to them. They're saying, how do we make this work with you all? And that's where the discussions are happening right now. In a lot of cases, some of the wells, honestly have to be removed because they're just too close to the river. And the potato growers are a major partner in this collaborative. And guess what? They're the ones identifying those wells and saying, these need to come out. And then they're talking to the landowners, believe it or not, and saying, you know what? It'd be really good if you wanted to sell this field off or put it back into wetland, or et cetera, And so when you have that, no one's forcing anybody to do something. They're doing it because they want to be part of the solution. And things are happening that maybe couldn't happen otherwise, right? Because they're in a leadership position. So sometimes it's ironic and sometimes it seems backwards to the way people might think. But when you're in an agricultural community, and I always say this, when an agricultural community identifies an issue and agrees on an issue, the power of those folks to work together, shoulder to shoulder, to by God fix that problem is one of the strongest forces on earth. And it's great to see it happening, seeing people working together to address these issues that are going on in this area. So I'm excited about it. And wetlands are a big part of the answer. That's the other really exciting thing about it. Yes.
Can you please explain how your organization gets wetlands restored? Do you hold easements? Do you fund the restoration process? Do you just coordinate for all the above?
So we are not a land management organization. We work mostly policy and we work organizing communities and helping input the wetland portion of the planning and the activities that need to happen. And that's when you work with the other partners, the land trusts, the government programs, the industry, the landowners, et cetera. We don't we help bring people together and get the planning going and make it happen that way. And a lot of our work is our office is 2 blocks off the Capitol, right? So a big chunk of our work is back and forth up to the top of the hill there, working with our legislators and helping. We work a lot with Department of Agriculture, starting working now with Department of Transportation, these different state agencies, emergency management, et cetera, help get the programs, get wetlands implemented into their programs, because oftentimes programs that have implications for land management give lip service to wetlands, but they don't seriously have a means to help landowners utilize wetlands as solutions. So we're working to change all that now. Really exciting. There's a lot of receptivity to it now, and it doesn't. With all the big storms that we've been having, there's been no part of the state that's been spared these big, crazy climate storms in the last several years. So it's on everybody's mind. And the nice thing about it is it's not a partisan issue. Both sides of the aisle are really interested in finding cost-effective solutions to the runoff issues that we're having right now throughout the state when these big storms come. And so folks are really looking at creative ways, and wetlands are a big part of that. So happy to be, working in that regard. So in terms of the Plover River work, we're helping with the planning. We're doing a lot of fundraising. We're doing a lot of the coordination. We're not hydrologists. We're not, doing land management. So things like that. Yes.
You have a role in the 14-mile creek?
We're starting to peripherally. We're starting to get involved in there. We've been asked by the county to come in and help with some things, and there's some DNR land in there as well. And so they're beginning some of the work, and they're having a little difficulty, the conservation folks, especially with the county, connecting with the agricultural landowners. And so they're going to need some help with that, and they're going to need to figure out a way to get people working together. But they're really interested in exploring creative solutions. And remember what we had in the 14-mile watershed. Right in the middle of that watershed is the historic Leola Marsh, right? And what did they do? They ditched that thing out so they could farm it. They farmed it for a few years, and then all those organically rich soils caught fire. And all that land that they thought was going to be productive cropland was worthless after a few years of draining it after that fire hit. So now it's mostly pasture land, right? And you've got this big, deep ditch network running through the middle of that marsh. And Buena Vista is a larger version of what Leola is. I think the answer is manipulation of the agricultural drains, getting water back on the landscape where it's not harming anybody, right? Drain it where we need to, but hey, let's put the Leola back. If we're just grazing it, usually grazing the groundwater helps the pasture. So what can we do in a creative way to start bringing back and using the Leola Marsh as a filter for dealing with nutrients and for flood flows and things like that? And they're starting to do some experiments now on the state wildlife area, the Leola Marsh wildlife area, where they're filling in a couple of ditches in their wildlife area, and they're measuring the rise in groundwater. The theory on that is if we could fill in these ditches, get the groundwater rising high enough where it's interacting with those historic wetland soils, that's where the nutrient processing happens. When the water interacts with the bacteria or the bugs or whatever's in that soil. And that's what they're looking at right now. So there's some experimental plots going on, or not plots, they're big areas where they're trying it out. And if it works, it might be a really effective way of dealing with the nutrient issues and some of the other issues in a way that not only doesn't hurt agriculture, but probably benefits it. So creative solutions. And of course, the cranberry growers are in the middle of that whole area. And so we're looking at that too, is how can we utilize their operations to help with it as well. So there's a lot of wildlife down in those places. If you haven't been down birding down amongst some of those cranberry operations in 14 miles, a lot of swans and stuff down there. So anyways, being creative, coming up, working with the people, and you know, how do we make this stuff fit in a real world? Is the fun and the challenge of this stuff, right? And there's no easy answers and there's no recipe book answers to this kind of stuff. So it's really challenging, but it's super rewarding as well. And when you're bringing people together and they're working together towards a common means, man, there's nothing better than that, is there? So, just
Tracey, what are your thoughts on like adding nesting boxes or other things to attract birds to the properties, to the wetlands? Or do you let nature take its course?
in my previous position, I managed tens of thousands of acres of floodplain lands and everything. It's the best wood duck production anywhere in eastern Washington. Never had one wood duck box ever. And I'm always a big fan of get the habitat back, right? But that being said, there's a lot of the wood duck boxes and bird boxes are happening on private land that allows those people to enjoy those birds, right? So in that respect, yeah, it's a really good thing because it's getting those people interested in those birds. I've always said in you know, if it's a DNR or federal wildlife land, they probably I'm not a big fan of them investing in box type management, but for private lands, in places where it's going to be something where you can observe the birds and of course the bluebird boxes on private lands, right, have brought those back, haven't they? And the wood duck boxes probably historically also had a big part about bringing wood ducks back on private properties. But you get down to lower Wisconsin Riverway, that place is wall to wall wood ducks right now, and it's all natural cavities. It's beautiful because it's the right habitat, right? So it's, you know, people want to go to that effort. I don't think public money should be spent on it because it's very expensive. It's almost like treating endangered species. But yeah, if you want to put wood duck boxes or bluebird boxes out for your enjoyment. Yes.
There's a question on the Zoom chat about any restoration work you've worked on in the Kickapoo watershed area.
So we're working with a partnership right now. It's right on the, just over the boundary of the Kickapoo in north of Richland Center, a place called Fancy Creek. And this is one of those, it's the upper part of Fancy Creek is a class 1 trout stream. The bottom part is a class 2. And there's a very large landowner that just put an easement together with the Mississippi Valley Conservancy Land Trust. She's got over 1,000 acres of the lower part of this creek and beautiful broad floodplain at the lower end of Fancy Creek, just north of Richland Center, flows into the Pine River. And the old meandering channels are in there, the old wetland basins, everything is just gorgeous. But back in the 40s, after World War II, I can't remember the exact year, but they cut a whole ditch through the whole thing. And all the natural water was then captured by this large drainage ditch, dug for who knows what reason, right? Because that's what we did back in those days. So this is one of those really interesting situations where how do you then work together to erase the effects of this really large ditch and get water back into its natural channel then in a cost-effective way so the floodplain can re-engage at a normal time. Right now, it takes a heroic, flood of, biblical proportions to interact with that floodplain. We can lift that thing back up and erase the effects of that ditch. It's too big to fill the whole ditch. So how can we erase the effects and get the thing? And that's what we're working on right now. It's really exciting stuff. And there's a couple of implications in the Kickapoo watershed now where these types of techniques, same thing, the Mississippi Valley Conservancy and some DNR folks are looking at, can we apply some of these techniques in the Kickapoo watershed? So the driftless area is in great need of cost-effective ways of reconnecting floodplains. And it's just starting right now. So it's really fun, exciting times in that incredibly complex, but incredibly disturbed landscape we call the driftless area, ancient landscape. So yeah, good stuff happening over there. And it literally means, how do we bring back natural conditions? How do we get floodplains reconnected? And it's not so easy when you've dropped 3 or 4 foot of sediment over top of your historic floodplain. Literally, you have to be looking at that new elevation as the new floodplain. You're not gonna dig that stuff out. They have in some areas, but that's not a solution across the board. So a lot of challenges and exciting things, getting people thinking a little differently than maybe they are now. And I've done a lot of that kind of stuff in my previous position. Most of my work was in floodplains, reconnecting them. So a lot of good techniques you can do, simple. And when you do it right and you do it like we said, you know, the good things happen that you would never expect. When you bring back the hydrology and bring back the situations in as much as possible historic means, good stuff happens that maybe you didn't predict. And all the surprises are usually good surprises, not bad surprises. So keep doing the stuff you're doing, you guys, and learning about this stuff and getting involved in land management and restoration and protection, and all the things that you're doing, because it's groups like you all that make this stuff happen. Sometimes you might think you're not, you know, making a big influence, but you really, really are. And important part of this community right now. So thank you for the work you all are doing. Anything else? Any other questions? All right. Well, there's information back on the table. Hang around if you have questions. You want to talk wetlands? I'm here. I'm here till dawn. I don't care till they kick us out. My arm.
Thank you, Tracy. Thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight to learn about wetlands. I learned a lot.
Good.
There's lots of trees over here too.
Yeah.
You know,
Trees and-
now the important stuff is brown.
Yeah. Still involved in-
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.